The carriage wheel cracked against a hidden stone, and Alina Wren was thrown forward so hard her palms slammed into the cold wood of the seat in front of her. Outside, the wind screamed like something alive, and for one heartbeat she was certain the whole carriage would tip into the ravine that ran along the northern road. She grabbed the leather strap above the window and held on, her knuckles white, her breath coming fast in the freezing air. "Steady now," called the driver, a thin man named Oliver Bramwell who had said almost nothing to her since they left the last village 3 hours ago. "We are close. Frostmere is close." Alina did not feel steady. She felt like a parcel being delivered to a place she had never asked to see, wrapped in a traveling cloak too thin for this cold. Her stomach twisted with a fear she had been trying to hide since dawn. 3 days ago, her father had called her into his study, and in the space of 10 minutes, her entire life had been rearranged without her permission. "You will go north," he had said, not meeting her eyes. "To Frostmere. There is nothing more for you here." She had asked why. He had not answered. Her mother had left the room before Alina could even finish her question, and that silence had told her more than any explanation could. Something had happened. Some debt, some scandal, some failure that belonged to the family and not to her. And yet she was the one being sent away, as if distance could erase whatever shame had settled over their name. Now, hours later, rattling through a forest so thick with frost that the trees looked like they had been carved from bone, Alina tried to remember the last time she had felt safe. It had been a long time, longer than she wanted to admit. The carriage lurched again, and this time it did not recover its balance so easily. She heard Oliver curse under his breath, heard the horses whinny in protest, and then, with a final shudder, the carriage came to a stop. "What is it?" Alina called, pushing the small window curtain aside. Snow blew sideways past the glass, thick and relentless, swallowing the road ahead. "Wheels caught," Oliver said. "Give me a moment." She should have stayed inside. That would have been the sensible thing. But sitting alone in the dark, listening to the wind claw at the carriage walls, felt worse than standing in the storm itself. So she pulled her hood up and stepped down into snow that reached past her ankles. The cold hit her like a blow. She had grown up in the South, where winter meant a light frost on the grass and nothing more. This was a different kind of cold, a cold that seemed to want something from her, that pressed against her skin and asked how much she could bear. "You should not be out here," Oliver said, kneeling beside the wheel, his hands already red from the work. "The Duke would not be pleased if you caught a fever before you even reached the gates." "The Duke," Alina repeated. She had heard the name a dozen times in the last 3 days and understood almost nothing about the man attached to it. "What do you know of him?" Oliver did not look up from the wheel. "I know he sent very particular instructions about your arrival, what road to take, what time you should reach the gates, even which room should be prepared for you." Alina frowned, the cold in her chest now nothing to do with the weather. How could he know when I would arrive? I did not know myself until 3 days ago. For the first time since she had climbed into the carriage that morning, Oliver looked directly at her, and there was something careful in his expression, something that looked almost like pity. "You will have to ask him that yourself, my lady. It is not my place to say more." She wanted to press him further, but the wind chose that moment to howl louder, and Oliver returned his attention to the stubborn wheel, muttering about ice and rust, and how much farther they had to go. Alina wrapped her arms around herself and stared into the white nothing beyond the road, trying to see any sign of the estate that was supposedly close enough to matter. There was nothing. Only snow and trees, and the deep, aching silence of a land that seemed to have forgotten what warmth was. She thought of her sister safe at home, likely already forgetting that Alina existed. She thought of her father's study, the way he had refused to look at her, the way the whole household had gone quiet the moment her trunk was carried out to the carriage that morning, as if she were something to be handled and not someone to be spoken to. Sent away. Forgotten. That was the plan, wasn't it? Somewhere far enough north that no one from her old life would ever think of her again. And yet Oliver's words kept turning over in her mind. Particular instructions. A room already prepared. A man she had never met, who somehow knew the exact hour she would arrive at his gates before she had known it herself. It did not make sense, and the not making sense of it frightened her more than the cold did. The wheel finally came free with a sharp crack, and Oliver climbed back onto the driver's seat, calling for her to get back inside before the storm grew worse. Elena obeyed, though her legs felt stiff and unwilling, and the carriage lurched forward once more, deeper into the white silence of the north. She tried to distract herself by remembering everything she had heard about Frostmere over the years, though it amounted to very little. It was an old estate, older than most of the noble houses in the south, built into the side of a mountain where the snow never fully melted, even in the warmest months of summer. The current duke had inherited the title young, after some tragedy she had never learned the details of, and he had not been seen at court in years. Some called him a recluse. Others, in hushed voices at parties Elena had barely paid attention to, called him something stranger. A man who kept to himself not out of shyness, but out of some deeper, unspoken reason. A man the North had swallowed whole. She had never imagined she would be sent to see for herself. The carriage climbed steadily now, the road growing narrower, the trees thinning until there was nothing on either side but rock and snow, and the distant gray shape of mountains under a sky that seemed to have given up on the color blue entirely. Elena pressed her face closer to the window, watching for any sign of the estate, and when it finally appeared, she forgot for a moment to breathe. Frostmere rose out of the mountainside like something that had grown there rather than been built. Towers of pale stone disappeared into low clouds. Long windows glowed faintly with candlelight despite the early hour, rows of them stretching across a face of the building, so wide it seemed to swallow the horizon. Ice clung to every ledge and archway, catching what little light there was and throwing it back in cold, sharp glints. It was beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful, elegant and dangerous all at once, and Elena felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite awe, but some uneasy mixture of both. "There it is," Oliver called down. "Frostmere, we will reach the gates within the hour." An hour. Elena sat back against the seat and pressed her hands together in her lap, trying to steady herself. Whatever waited for her behind those gates, whatever the Duke wanted with a disgraced young woman from a family he had never met, she would face it. She had no other choice. There was no home to return to, not really, not one that wanted her back. But as the carriage rolled closer, and the towers of Frostmere grew larger against the pale sky, Elena could not shake the feeling that she was not arriving somewhere new so much as arriving somewhere expected. As if a door had been left open for her long before she knew she would need to walk through it. The gates themselves were enormous, black iron twisted into patterns of frost and thorn, and they stood open, as though they had been waiting. A row of servants had already gathered in the courtyard beyond, despite the cold, despite the early hour, despite the fact that no message could possibly have reached the house faster than the carriage that carried her. Elena's stomach turned as the carriage passed beneath the gate and into the courtyard. Every face in that row of servants turned toward her at once, and there was something in their expressions she could not name. Not curiosity, exactly, something closer to recognition. As if they had been told exactly who she was. As if they had been told exactly when she would come. The carriage rolled to a stop, and Oliver climbed down to open the door, offering his hand to help her step out into the courtyard. The cold wrapped around her immediately, sharper here than it had been on the road, and Elena lifted her chin, determined not to let her fear show on her face, whatever waited for her inside those walls. A woman stepped forward from the line of servants, older, with kind eyes and a warm cloak that seemed almost out of place among so much cold stone and colder faces. "Lady Wren," she said, and there was no question in her voice, only certainty. "Welcome to Frostmere. We have been expecting you." Elena's mouth went dry. "How could you have been expecting me? I only learned I was coming here 3 days ago." The woman's expression did not change, though something flickered behind her eyes, something careful, something that suggested she knew far more than she was willing to say. "The Duke will explain everything, my lady. He has been waiting a very long time to meet you." Behind the woman, high above the courtyard, A window flickered with movement, a shape pausing behind the glass just long enough for Alina to catch it before it withdrew into the shadows of the room beyond. Someone had been watching her arrive, and whoever it was had not looked surprised to see her at all. The woman who had greeted her introduced herself as Mrs. Agatha Price, the housekeeper of Frostmere, and she moved through the entrance hall with the brisk efficiency of someone who had run this house for many years and intended to run it for many more. Alina followed her across floors of dark polished stone, past walls hung with tapestries so old their colors had faded into soft grays and blues, and tried to memorize the path, though the corridors twisted in ways that made her doubt she could find her way back to the entrance if she needed to. "The Duke asks that you rest first," Mrs. Price said over her shoulder. "You have had a long journey, and the roads are unkind this time of year. He will receive you this evening, once you have had a chance to settle." "And if I would rather see him now?" Alina asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Mrs. Price paused at the top of a narrow staircase, and for a moment something like amusement crossed her face. "The Duke is a patient man, my lady, but he keeps his own schedule. I would advise against trying to change it on your first afternoon." There was nothing cruel in the way she said it, but there was a warning buried in the words all the same, and Alina decided, for now, to let the matter rest. She was tired. The cold had settled into her bones during the long ride, and the thought of a warm room, however unfamiliar, was more appealing than she wanted to admit. They climbed 2 more flights of stairs before Mrs. Price stopped before a heavy wooden door carved with a pattern of frost and vine that matched the gates below. She pushed it open, and Alina stepped inside, expecting the kind of plain, forgotten guest room she imagined a disgraced young woman might be given in a house that owed her family nothing. What she found instead stopped her breath entirely. The room was warm, a fire already burning low and steady in the hearth, and every detail of it seemed built for her specifically, not for some imagined guest but for Alina Wren herself. The curtains were a deep blue-green, the exact color of the dress she had worn to her 16th birthday, a dress she had loved so much she had cried when it no longer fit her the following year. A small writing desk sat beneath the window, stocked with paper and ink, and beside it, on a low shelf, sat a row of books, several of which she recognized immediately as titles she had read and loved as a girl, books she had not thought about in years. "This cannot be right," Alina said quietly, stepping further into the room as though she expected the illusion to shatter if she moved too quickly. This room was not prepared for a stranger. Mrs. Price lingered in the doorway, watching her with that same careful expression from before. "The Duke is very particular about how his guests are received, my lady. He likes things to be comfortable." "Comfortable is one thing," Alina said, turning to face her. "This is something else, these books, this color. I have never told anyone I loved this shade of blue-green, not since I was a girl. How could he possibly know?" For a moment, Mrs. Price said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough that Alina began to wonder if she had asked something forbidden. Then the housekeeper's expression softened, just slightly, into something that might have been sympathy. "There are many things about this house you will come to understand in time, my lady. I am not the one who should explain them to you. That is the Duke's task and his alone. For now, please, rest, eat something. The dinner bell will ring at 7, and he will expect you in the great hall." She left before Alina could ask anything further, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft, final click, and Alina stood alone in a room built from the private corners of her own memory, feeling less like a guest and more like a puzzle someone else had already solved. She did not rest, not at first. Instead, she moved slowly around the room, running her fingers along the spines of the books, lifting the corner of the curtain to check the color against the fading afternoon light, opening the small wardrobe in the corner to find dresses hanging inside that fit her measurements exactly, in colors she would have chosen for herself if given the choice. It was not comforting. It was the opposite of comforting. Someone had studied her, closely and carefully, for what must have been years, and she had never once felt watched. By the time the fire burned low and the light outside the window faded into the deep blue of early evening, Exhaustion finally caught up with her, and Alina allowed herself to sit by the hearth, wrapped in a blanket from the bed, watching the flames and trying to piece together some explanation that made sense. A distant relative, perhaps, someone who had known her family well enough to remember such details. Or letters exchanged between her parents and the Duke, describing her in more detail than she had ever imagined they would share with a stranger. Neither explanation felt complete, but neither did the alternative that kept surfacing in the back of her mind, the possibility that this house, this Duke, had known things about her that no letter could have contained. When the dinner bell finally rang, low and resonant through the stone halls, Alina rose and dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark green gown from the wardrobe, one that fit her so precisely it might as well have been made by her own dressmaker back home. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above the desk, trying to find some steadiness in her own face before she had to walk downstairs and meet the man who had, apparently, been expecting her for far longer than 3 days. A young servant girl guided her through the twisting corridors toward the great hall, and with every step, Alina's heartbeat grew louder in her own ears. The corridors here were different from the entrance hall, older somehow, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. She recognized none of the faces, though several wore expressions so severe they made her walk a little faster, eager to leave their painted gazes behind. The great hall, when she finally reached it, was enormous, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow far above, its long table set for only 2, at opposite ends, with more candles than Alina had ever seen in one room burning steadily despite the draft that moved through the space. And at the far end of that table, already seated, already waiting, sat the Duke of Frostmere. He rose as she entered, and Alina found herself momentarily unable to speak. She had expected, somehow, an older man, someone whose reclusive reputation matched a face lined with age and isolation. Instead, the man who stood at the end of the table looked barely older than she was, with dark hair that fell loosely around a face carved from sharp, careful lines, and eyes so pale a gray they seemed almost silver in the candlelight. He wore no crown, no obvious mark of his title, only simple dark clothing that somehow made him look more commanding rather than less. "Lady Wren," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying easily across the length of the hall, "thank you for joining me. I hope your room was to your satisfaction." "It was," Alina said carefully, crossing the hall as a servant pulled out her chair, "though I confess I have a great many questions about how it came to be so." Something flickered across the Duke's face, too quick for her to name, and he gestured for her to sit before returning to his own chair. "All in good time, Lady Wren. Tonight, I would rather you eat something warm and rest properly before we speak of difficult matters." "With respect, Your Grace," Alina said, and she was proud of how steady her own voice sounded despite the unease coiling in her chest. "I have spent 3 days traveling into a country I have never seen, sent by my own family with no explanation, to a house that somehow knew my favorite color and the exact hour I would arrive at its gates. I would rather not wait for difficult matters. I would rather understand them now." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and in the flicker of the candlelight, Alina thought she saw something shift behind his pale eyes, something that looked almost like relief, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask him directly instead of tiptoeing around the strangeness of this house. "Very well," he said finally, setting down the glass he had been holding. "You deserve honesty, Lady Wren, more than most who arrive at these gates ever receive. But I warn you, once I begin to explain, there will be no returning to the comfortable ignorance you traveled here with. Are you certain you wish to know?" Alina thought of her father's study, the silence that had followed her question, the way her whole family had turned away from her rather than offer a single word of explanation. She thought of the room upstairs, built from pieces of a childhood she barely remembered herself, and the servants who had greeted her as though her arrival had been circled on a calendar for years. "I am certain," she said. "I would rather know the truth, whatever it costs me, than spend another moment wondering what I have walked into." The Duke's mouth curved, not quite a smile, something more solemn than that, something closer to respect. "Then I will tell you what I can." But first you should know my name, since it seems no one thought to give it to you before they sent you north. I am Gideon Ashford, Duke of Frostmere. And you, Lady Wren, are not the first member of your family I have waited for. You are simply the first one who was ever sent to me." Alina's fork stilled halfway to her plate. "What do you mean, the first one sent to you? Sent for what purpose?" Gideon's expression grew distant, as though he were looking not at her but through her, into some memory that lived years behind his pale eyes. "That, Lady Wren, is a story that begins long before either of us was born, and one I have been waiting a very long time to finally tell someone who might understand it." Outside the tall windows of the great hall, the wind picked up again, throwing snow against the glass in soft, insistent waves, and somewhere deep in the stone walls of Frostmere, a clock began to strike the hour, each chime rolling through the silence like the slow turning of something that had been set into motion long before Alina Wren had ever climbed into that carriage. She did not know yet what she had walked into, but she understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that there would be no going back to the life she had left behind. Whatever Frostmere wanted from her, it had been waiting a very long time to collect. Gideon did not begin immediately. He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the tall windows at the side of the hall, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the snow fall in heavy sheets against the dark glass. Alina waited, her food forgotten in front of her, every nerve in her body pulled tight with the effort of staying patient. 60 years ago, Gideon began at last, before either of us was born, a woman named Cordelia Wren came to Frostmere. Your great-aunt, if the family records are correct, though I suspect you have never heard her name spoken in your household." Alina shook her head slowly. "Never. I did not know I had a great-aunt." "That does not surprise me," Gideon said, turning back to face her. "Families are very good at forgetting the members who cause them trouble, and Cordelia caused a great deal of trouble, though not through any fault of her own. She came to Frostmere much as you did, sent north under circumstances no one in her family cared to explain. My grandfather, who held this title before my father, was the one who received her." "What happened to her?" Alina asked, leaning forward despite herself. Gideon's jaw tightened. "She died here, not through violence and not through neglect. I want to be clear about that much immediately. She died of an illness that swept through this house during a particularly harsh winter, the kind of illness that took many lives in those years and spared very few who caught it. But before she died, she made my grandfather a promise, and it is that promise which brought you to this table tonight." Alina's throat had gone dry. "What promise?" She told him that her family's line was cursed with misfortune, that every generation since her own grandmother had suffered some terrible loss, some scandal, some tragedy that stripped them of standing and left the family scrambling to recover. She believed, and my grandfather came to believe alongside her, that this misfortune was tied to an old debt her family owed to Frostmere, a debt so old that no one alive could say exactly how it began. She asked my grandfather to watch over her family from a distance, to make certain that whenever the Wren line produced a daughter who needed protection, protection would be waiting for her here, whether her family understood the offer or not. Alina sat back slowly, trying to absorb what she had just heard. "You are telling me that for 60 years your family has been watching mine, waiting." "Yes," Gideon said simply. "My grandfather kept the promise until his death and passed the responsibility to my father, who passed it to me when I inherited this title far younger than I ever expected to. We have watched every generation of the Wren family since Cordelia's death. We have seen the scandals. We have seen the debts. We have seen daughters married off quickly and quietly to smooth over some family embarrassment, and sons sent away when their behavior threatened to bring shame to the household. And every time, we have waited to see if the pattern would repeat, if history would demand another sacrifice from your family, the way it demanded one from Cordelia. And this time," Alina said slowly, the pieces settling into place with a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter outside, "it was me." Gideon's expression grew grave. "Your father's business dealings collapsed 6 months ago, Lady Wren. I do not know how much you were told of the details, but the debts he accumulated were significant enough to threaten the family's entire standing. He needed a way to erase the shame quickly, before word spread through the circles that mattered to him, and sending a daughter north to a distant relation no one remembered well enough to question, was the easiest way to remove a visible reminder of the family's decline. Alina felt something crack open in her chest, old and painful, a wound she had not realized she was still carrying. So I was sent away to hide a debt, not because of anything I did, not because of any scandal of my own. No, Gideon said, his voice softening slightly. You did nothing wrong, Lady Wren, you were simply convenient. A daughter unmarried, easy to explain away as visiting distant family in the north, while your father worked to repair what he had broken. The room felt suddenly very large and very cold, despite the fire burning steadily nearby. Alina pressed her hands together in her lap, trying to steady herself against the anger rising in her chest, sharp and sudden. And you knew. You knew I was coming, knew exactly when, knew what color I loved as a girl, knew which books I treasured. How long have you been watching me specifically, and not simply my family as a whole? Gideon did not look away from her question, though something in his expression suggested the answer cost him something to give. Since you were 12 years old, Lady Wren. My father received word that your family's fortunes had begun to shift, and he asked me, as his heir, to begin paying closer attention to you specifically, since you were the eldest daughter and therefore the most likely to bear the weight of whatever crisis eventually arrived. I have received reports on your life for nearly a decade. Your favorite books, your favorite colors, the dresses you loved and the ones you did not. It was my responsibility to know these things, so that when the day came, as we both suspected it eventually would, you would not arrive at a stranger's house feeling entirely alone. Alina did not know whether to feel grateful or violated, and the confusion of it left her momentarily speechless. A decade. He had been collecting details of her life for a decade, long before she had ever heard his name, long before she had any reason to suspect that a stranger in the far north was cataloging her favorite colors and the books that made her cry. That is not comfort, Your Grace, she said finally, her voice tighter than she intended. That is surveillance. However kind your intentions, you have been watching a girl who never consented to being watched, collecting pieces of her life as though she were a puzzle to be assembled rather than a person to be spoken with directly. Gideon's expression did not harden at her words, as she half expected it to. Instead, something like shame crossed his features, quick and genuine. You are right to be angry. I have turned this same accusation on myself many times over the years, wondering if the promise Cordelia extracted from my grandfather was truly protection or something closer to possession, dressed up in kinder language. I do not have a clean answer for you, Lady Wren. I only know that when your father's letter arrived 3 days ago, asking if Frostmere might take in a daughter for a time, I could not bring myself to refuse, knowing what waited for you here if I did not prepare properly. What would have waited for me, Alina asked, if you had refused? A house with no warmth prepared for you, Gideon said quietly. A room chosen at random, cold and unfamiliar, in an estate run by a duke who felt no particular obligation toward a stranger's daughter. I could have received you as any distant relation receives an inconvenient guest, with polite distance and nothing more. Instead, I chose to receive you as someone I felt responsible for, because I have felt responsible for you, in some strange and uninvited way, for nearly 10 years. Alina studied him across the long table, trying to reconcile the version of this man she had imagined during the carriage ride, some cold recluse indifferent to the world beyond his gates, with the man now sitting across from her, carrying a decade of quiet, unspoken responsibility for a girl he had never met until tonight. Why did Cordelia believe her family was cursed? She asked finally, choosing the question that felt safest among the many crowding her mind. What was the debt she believed you were owed? Gideon was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown careful, measured in a way that told Alina he was choosing his words with great precision. That is a longer story, Lady Wren, and one I do not fully understand myself, despite having inherited the responsibility to honor it. The debt predates written record in this house. My grandfather believed it involved a broken promise between our two families, generations before either Cordelia or I were born, though the details of that promise were lost long before he inherited the title. What remains is only the consequence, a pattern of misfortune in your family, and a promise in mine to soften it whenever we could. That is not an answer, Alina said. That is a mystery wrapped inside another mystery. I am aware, Gideon admitted, and for the first time since she had entered the hall, something like a genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth, brief and unguarded. I have spent a great deal of my life trying to unravel it, with very little success. Perhaps, now that you are here, we might make more progress together than I have managed alone. Alina wanted to remain angry. Some part of her, the part still raw from her father's cold dismissal, and the strange violation of arriving in a room built from private memories she had never shared, wanted to hold onto that anger like a shield. But sitting in the candle-lit hall, listening to this man speak with such careful honesty about a burden he had carried since he was barely a man himself, she found the anger softening into something more complicated, something closer to curiosity, and beneath that, a fragile, cautious relief that she had not, after all, been sent north simply to be forgotten. I did not choose to come here, she said finally, but I find myself wanting to understand what has been done to my family and why. If that means staying at Frostmere longer than I expected, then I suppose I will stay. Gideon inclined his head, something in his posture easing, as though he had been holding his breath since she walked into the hall and could finally release it. Then, let us begin properly, Lady Wren. Welcome to Frostmere. I am sorry it took a lifetime of watching for us to finally speak. Outside, the storm continued to press against the windows, but inside the great hall, something had shifted, quiet and uncertain. The first thread of trust stretched carefully between two people who had known each other, in some strange and lopsided way, for far longer than either of them had ever spoken aloud. Alina did not sleep well that first night, though the bed was soft and the fire burned steadily until dawn. Her mind kept turning over everything Gideon had told her, searching for the shape of a story that still refused to come fully into focus. A curse, a broken promise, a debt no one alive could properly explain. It was the kind of tale she might have dismissed as superstition if she had heard it anywhere else. But here, in a house that had known her favorite color before she arrived, it felt uncomfortably close to true. She rose early, dressed in one of the gowns from the wardrobe that fit her so precisely it unsettled her all over again, and made her way downstairs in search of breakfast, though what she truly wanted was answers. She found Mrs. Price in a small sitting room near the kitchens, going over the day's household accounts with a careful, practiced eye. "Good morning, my lady," the housekeeper said, glancing up. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," Alina said, choosing honesty over politeness. "Mrs. Price, I wonder if you might help me with something. The Duke mentioned a woman named Cordelia Wren last night, my great-aunt, who died here many years ago. Is there any record of her time at Frostmere? Letters, perhaps, or journals?" Something careful crossed the housekeeper's face, the same expression Alina had noticed the day before, the look of someone who knew more than she was permitted to share freely. "There is a library in the East Wing, my lady, where such records are kept. I would not object to you visiting it, though I should warn you that some of what you find there may be difficult to read." "I would rather know difficult truths than comfortable silence," Alina said, echoing the words she had spoken to Gideon the night before, and Mrs. Price's expression softened into something almost like approval. "Then I will have someone show you the way after breakfast. The Duke rises late most mornings, so you will have the library to yourself for several hours, if that suits you." It suited her perfectly. After a quiet breakfast eaten alone in a small dining room off the kitchens, Alina followed a young servant boy through corridors that grew narrower and older the further east they traveled, until they arrived at a heavy door bound in iron, which the boy pushed open with visible effort. The library beyond was smaller than Alina expected, but every wall was lined floor to ceiling with shelves, and the air carried the dry, dusty scent of old paper that had not been disturbed in a very long time. A single tall window let in pale morning light, and beneath it sat a reading table, already cleared as though it had been prepared for her use. She began searching the shelves methodically, starting with sections that seemed to hold family records, ledgers, and correspondence, though the handwriting on many of the spines had faded too badly to read. It took nearly an hour before she found what she was looking for, a slim leather journal tucked between two much larger volumes, its cover embossed with a single faded initial. C. Alina's hands trembled slightly as she carried it to the reading table and opened the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant but hurried. The ink faded to a soft brown, and the first entry was dated more than 60 years earlier, shortly after Cordelia Wren's arrival at Frostmere. "I do not understand why I have been sent here," the first entry read. "My family will not explain themselves, only that I am to remain at Frostmere until further notice, and that I should consider myself fortunate the Duke has agreed to receive me at all. I do not feel fortunate. I feel discarded." Alina's chest tightened at the familiarity of those words, the echo of her own thoughts from 3 days ago, written by a woman she had never known, more than 60 years before Alina herself had ever set foot in this house. She turned the page and continued reading, entry after entry, watching Cordelia's fear slowly soften into something more complicated as the weeks passed at Frostmere. The Duke's father, whom Cordelia referred to only as his Grace, appeared throughout the early entries as a distant but not unkind figure, much as Gideon had described his own grandfather. But it was further into the journal, perhaps a third of the way through, that Alina found an entry that made her breath catch entirely. "I have learned the truth of why I was sent here," Cordelia had written, "though I wish I had not asked. His Grace tells me my family owes a debt to this house, one that predates any living memory, tied to a promise broken generations ago between our two families. He will not tell me the details of the promise itself, only that it involves a marriage that never took place, a betrothal broken at the final hour for reasons no one now remembers, and that the breaking of it cursed both families in different ways. His family, he says, was cursed with loneliness, generation after generation, unable to find lasting happiness no matter how they tried. Mine, it seems, was cursed with misfortune, scandal following scandal, until the family name itself became something to be quietly buried rather than proudly carried." Alina read the passage twice, then a third time, trying to absorb the shape of what it suggested. A broken betrothal, generations ago, between the Wren family and the Ashford family, a promise shattered so completely that its consequences still echoed through both bloodlines more than half a century later. She turned the page eagerly, searching for more detail, but the next several entries spoke only of small domestic matters, the changing seasons, a growing fondness Cordelia seemed to be developing for the young man who would one day become the Duke's heir. Then abruptly the entry stopped. The final entry in the journal was dated only weeks before Cordelia's recorded date of death, and it was shorter than the others, the handwriting less steady than before. "I am not well," Cordelia had written. "The fever that has taken so many in the village these past weeks has finally reached me, and I do not know how many more entries I will have the strength to write. Before I go, I want to record this much, in case it matters to someone who comes after me. I asked His Grace to make a promise before I understood what I was asking of him. I asked him to watch over my family, to protect whichever daughter might one day need protection the way I needed it when I first arrived here, frightened and alone. I do not know if this was wisdom or selfishness on my part. Perhaps it was both. I only know that I could not bear the thought of another Wren daughter arriving at these gates as afraid as I once was, with no one waiting to receive her kindly. If she comes, whoever she is, I hope she finds here what I found. Not a curse, but a kind of home I never expected." Alina closed the journal slowly, her eyes stinging with tears she had not expected to feel for a woman she had never known existed until the night before. Cordelia had not simply extracted a promise from fear or superstition, as Gideon's careful retelling had suggested. She had done it out of something closer to love, a final act of care extended toward a family that had cast her aside without explanation, hoping that whoever followed her north would not have to arrive as frightened as she had. The library door opened behind her, and Alina turned to find Gideon standing in the doorway, still dressed for mourning, his expression unreadable as his gaze settled on the journal in her hands. "I see you found her," he said quietly. "I did," Alina said, wiping quickly at her eyes before he could see them fall. "You did not tell me she loved your family, Your Grace. You made it sound as though the promise was extracted through fear of a curse. She wrote of it as something closer to hope." Gideon crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair across from her, his pale eyes fixed on the closed journal between them. "I did not want to color your understanding of her before you had the chance to read her words for yourself. Cordelia's story is not mine to tell in pieces, Lady Wren. It deserved to be read in full, in her own hand, before I offered any interpretation of my own." "There is more here than a curse," Alina said. "A broken betrothal generations before either of us was born. Do you know whose betrothal it was, whose promise was broken?" Something flickered across Gideon's face, and for a moment Alina thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat back into the careful, guarded distance she had first encountered upon her arrival. But then he exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "I do know," he said, "though I did not know until I was much older than I would have liked, and I have spent every year since wishing I had learned it sooner, before the knowledge cost me something I was not prepared to lose." Alina leaned forward, her earlier grief giving way to a sharper, more urgent curiosity. "Then tell me now, Your Grace. I have read Cordelia's fear and her hope in her own words. I would rather hear the rest of it from you directly than piece it together from fading ink." Gideon studied her for a long moment, and outside the tall library window, the pale morning light shifted as clouds moved across the winter sky, throwing long shadows across the dusty shelves that surrounded them. "Very well," he said finally. "But once I tell you this part of the story, Lady Wren, you will understand why your arrival at Frostmere was never simply a matter of hiding your father's debts. There is a reason it had to be you, specifically, and not any other daughter your family might have sent in your place." Alina's heart quickened, though whether from fear or anticipation she could no longer clearly tell. "Then tell me," she said again, softer this time. "I am ready to hear it." Gideon rose from his chair and walked toward the tall window, much as he had done the night before in the great hall, as though the story he was about to tell required distance, some space between himself and the person hearing it. "The betrothal that was broken," he began, "was arranged between the eldest son of the Ashford family and the eldest daughter of the Wren family, 3 generations before either of us was born. It was not a marriage of affection. Such arrangements rarely were in those days. It was a matter of land and alliance, 2 powerful families joining their fortunes through their children, as was common enough at the time." "What happened to break it?" Alina asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer would not be simple. "The Wren daughter fell in love with someone else," Gideon said. "A man far beneath her family's standing, a groundskeeper's son, according to the records I have found, though the details of his identity are otherwise lost to time. She refused the betrothal on the eve of the wedding itself, humiliating the Ashford family publicly, and fled south with the man she loved rather than honor the arrangement her family had made on her behalf." Alina's breath caught, and the Ashford family never recovered from the humiliation. "Not entirely, no," Gideon said. "My ancestor, the young man who was to be married, never took another wife. He grew old alone in this house, and the loneliness seemed to settle into the family line itself after his death, passed down through generations like an inheritance no one wanted but none could refuse. My father rarely spoke of love. My grandfather married late, and unhappily from what little I have gathered through old letters. And I myself have lived here since my father's death, alone, with no expectation of finding anything different." "And the Wren family?" Alina asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the shape of the answer. "Misfortune," Gideon said. Scandal after scandal, generation after generation, as though the family could never quite outrun the consequences of that one broken promise. Debts, disgraces, daughters married off hastily to smooth over embarrassments, or sent away entirely when the embarrassment could not be smoothed over any other way. Cordelia believed, and I have come to believe alongside her, that the pattern was not coincidence but consequence, the slow unwinding of a promise that should never have been broken in the way it was broken, however understandable the reasons behind it. Alina sat with this for a long moment, turning it over carefully in her mind. "You believe in curses, then, your grace, truly." Gideon turned from the window, and for the first time, something like uncertainty crossed his composed features. "I do not know what I believe, Lady Wren. I have lived my entire adult life inside a house that has never known love without loss, watching a family I have never met suffer misfortune after misfortune from a distance, and I have run out of other explanations that satisfy me better. Perhaps it is superstition. Perhaps it is simply the weight of expectation, passed down through generations until it becomes its own kind of prophecy. I only know that I have felt the loneliness in this house for as long as I can remember, and I have wondered, more times than I can count, whether it will ever end, or whether I am simply the latest in a long line of Ashford men destined to grow old within these walls, alone." Something in his voice, quiet and unguarded, struck Alina harder than she expected. She had arrived at Frostmere believing herself the only one who had been discarded, sent away to be forgotten by a family who no longer wanted the burden of her presence. But sitting across from Gideon now, listening to him speak of a loneliness that had settled into his own bloodline generations before he was born, she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that he had been just as trapped by circumstances beyond his control as she had been. "You said there was a reason it had to be me," she said carefully. "Specifically, not simply any daughter of the Wren family. What did you mean by that?" Gideon returned to his chair, and this time when he looked at her, his pale eyes held something that felt less like careful distance and more like honesty offered at real cost. "My grandfather's promise to Cordelia was not simply to protect whichever Wren daughter needed protection. There was a second part to it, one I have never spoken of to anyone outside my own family, and one I debated for a long time whether to share with you at all." "Tell me," Alina said. "I did not travel this far to be given half the truth." Gideon nodded slowly, as though her insistence confirmed something he had already suspected about her. The promise stated that if a daughter of the Wren line and a son of the Ashford line ever found genuine affection for one another, freely chosen and not arranged, the old debt between our families would finally be considered paid. Not through obligation, Lady Wren, not through another arranged betrothal forced upon two people who had no say in the matter, only through choice. My grandfather believed, and Cordelia believed alongside him, that only a promise freely made could undo a promise that had been broken so painfully, all those years before. Alina felt her pulse quicken, understanding settling over her slowly, in pieces. "So when my father's debts forced him to send a daughter north, and I was the eldest, unmarried, the family suddenly remembered an old relation none of them had spoken of in years." "Yes," Gideon admitted. "Though I do not believe your father understood the full weight of what he was setting in motion when he wrote to me, I do not think he knew of the second part of the promise at all. He knew only that Frostmere had once offered protection to a Wren daughter in trouble, and he hoped the same courtesy might be extended to you, without asking too many questions about why." "But you knew," Alina said. "You knew exactly what my arrival might mean, long before I ever climbed into that carriage." "I did," Gideon said, and there was no apology in his voice, only quiet honesty. "I will not pretend otherwise, Lady Wren. When your father's letter arrived, I understood immediately what it might mean, not simply for the debt my family owes yours, but for the loneliness I have carried since I was a boy, watching my father grow old and bitter in these halls, wondering if I was destined for the same fate. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that you might arrive and find something here worth staying for freely, without any pressure from me, or from the old promise hanging over both our families." Alina studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of manipulation, any hint that his careful honesty was simply another kind of performance designed to secure her affection through obligation rather than genuine feeling. But she found none. Only a man who had spent his entire life inside a lonely inheritance, hoping quietly that circumstances he could not fully control might finally offer him something different. "I do not know what I feel yet, Your Grace," she said finally, choosing honesty of her own in return. "I have known you for less than a day. I cannot promise you the ending your family has been waiting generations to receive, simply because circumstance has placed me at your table." "I would never ask you to," Gideon said quickly, something almost urgent in his voice. "I would rather live with this loneliness for the rest of my days than force you into an affection you did not freely choose. If the debt is never paid, Lady Wren, then it is never paid. I will not pretend the disappointment would not weigh on me. But I would rather bear that weight honestly than watch you pretend to feel something you do not, simply to satisfy an old promise neither of us made." Something in Alina's chest loosened at his words, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying since the moment Mrs. Price had greeted her in the courtyard the day before. Whatever else Gideon Ashford was, whatever strange, generational obligation had brought her to his gates, he was not asking her to perform affection she did not feel. He was simply asking her to stay long enough to see whether genuine feeling might grow between them, given time and honesty rather than obligation. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "we might begin as we mean to continue. Not as a debt to be settled or a curse to be broken, but simply as two people, given an unusual circumstance, trying to understand one another honestly." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, warm and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him, and for the first time since her arrival, the great cold weight of Frostmere seemed to ease, if only slightly, if only for the length of that quiet morning in the dusty library. "I would like that very much, Lady Wren," he said. "Alina," she corrected softly. "If we are beginning honestly, you might as well use my given name." "Alina," Gideon repeated, and something in the way he said it, careful and deliberate, as though testing the shape of it on his tongue, made her chest warm despite the cold light filtering through the library window. "Then you must call me Gideon if we are to continue in this manner." Over the days that followed, something between them did begin to shift, slowly, carefully, built not from grand gestures but from small, accumulated moments. Gideon showed her the estate beyond the great hall and the library, walking her through frozen gardens where ice sculptures of long-forgotten flowers still stood from some earlier winter, explaining the history of each wing of the house, with a knowledge so thorough it could only have come from years of solitary wandering through empty corridors, searching for company that had never arrived until now. Alina, in turn, found herself sharing pieces of her own life she had not spoken of in years, memories of her mother before the family's fortunes had turned, the sister she missed more than she had expected to, the quiet ache of growing up in a household that measured her worth by how well she could be married off to smooth over whatever crisis arose next. Gideon listened with a patience she had rarely encountered, asking careful questions rather than offering hollow comfort, and slowly, the wariness she had carried since stepping down from that carriage began to soften into something gentler. It was not love, not yet, not the kind of grand and immediate affection found in the stories Alina had read as a girl. It was something quieter and more careful than that, built brick by brick from honesty rather than obligation, and Alina found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind the slow pace of it at all. If anything, she found herself grateful for it, grateful that whatever grew between them in the cold, quiet halls of Frostmere was growing on its own terms, freely chosen, exactly as the old promise had demanded. But even as the warmth between them deepened, a different kind of chill was beginning to gather beyond the estate's frozen gates, one that neither Alina nor Gideon yet understood was already moving toward them, carried north on roads far less forgiving than the one Alina had traveled to arrive. The letter arrived on a gray morning nearly 3 weeks after Alina's arrival, carried by a rider who had pushed his horse hard enough through the snow that the animal stood trembling and steaming in the courtyard. By the time Mrs. Price brought the sealed envelope to the small sitting room where Alina and Gideon had taken to sharing breakfast together most mornings. Gideon broke the seal with the careful precision of a man accustomed to bad news arriving without warning, and Alina watched his face carefully as his eyes moved across the page, watched the ease that had settled into his features over the past weeks harden back into something colder and more guarded. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her cup. "A letter from Lord Edmund Hale," Gideon said slowly, folding the paper closed. "A neighboring family whose lands border Frostmere along the eastern ridge. He writes to inform me that he intends to visit within the week, along with his daughter." "That does not sound like troubling news on its own," Alina said, though something in Gideon's expression suggested otherwise. "Lord Hale has made his intentions clear on more than one occasion over the years," Gideon said carefully. "He believes a union between his daughter and myself would strengthen both our families considerably, and he has not been shy about pursuing the matter, despite my repeated refusals. This visit is not simply a courtesy call, Alina. He is coming to press the matter again, and he will not be pleased to find another woman already established in my household." Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter chill outside. "Established how?" "I am a guest, Gideon. Nothing more has been announced or decided between us." "I know that," Gideon said quickly, reaching across the table to take her hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks but that now carried an urgency she had not felt from him before. "But Lord Hale is not a man who concerns himself with technicalities, and he has influence enough at court to make trouble for both our families if he chooses to interpret your presence here in whatever manner suits his purposes." "What kind of trouble?" Alina asked. Gideon's expression grew grim. "He could spread word that you arrived at Frostmere already compromised in some fashion, that your father sent you north not to protect you from scandal, but because you had already caused one. It would not be true, but truth has rarely mattered to men like Lord Hale when a convenient lie serves their purposes better. Your family's reputation, already fragile after your father's debts, would not survive such rumors easily. And my own reputation, quiet as it has been these past years, would not remain untouched either." Alina pulled her hand back slightly, her mind racing through the implications. She had come to Frostmere believing herself already discarded by her family, already beyond further ruin. But Gideon was right. There was a difference between being quietly forgotten and being actively humiliated, and if Lord Hale chose the latter path, the consequences would reach far beyond these frozen walls, back to her sister, her mother, the fragile remains of a family reputation that had already suffered more than it could easily bear. "Then we must be careful how we receive him," Alina said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "What does he know of me currently?" "Very little, I suspect," Gideon said. "News travels slowly this far north in winter, and I have not announced your presence to anyone beyond my own household. But servants talk, Alina, even loyal ones, and Lord Hale has a way of extracting information from people who did not intend to share it." Over the following days, the household at Frostmere grew tense in a way Alina had not experienced since her first uncertain hours within its walls. Mrs. Price oversaw preparations for Lord Hale's visit with visible unease, and Gideon grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours in his study poring over old correspondence and estate records, as though searching for some strategy that might protect both their families from whatever Lord Hale intended to bring with him. Alina, for her part, found herself growing restless in a different way. She had spent the past weeks slowly softening toward the idea that Frostmere might become something more than a temporary exile, that the careful warmth growing between herself and Gideon might eventually settle into something lasting. The threat of Lord Hale's arrival, and the accusations he might bring with him, felt like a cold hand reaching in to undo everything they had carefully built. "You do not have to face him," Gideon told her, 3 days before Lord Hale was expected to arrive. They sat together in the library, the same room where Alina had first read Cordelia's journal, though the mood between them now carried none of the earlier warmth. "I could arrange for you to remain in your rooms during his visit, Avoid any direct confrontation entirely. And let him say whatever he pleases about my absence, Alina said, shaking her head firmly. No, Gideon. I have spent my entire life being hidden away, managed, moved from place to place at the convenience of other people's reputations. I will not hide from Lord Hale as though I have something to be ashamed of. If he comes here intending to spread lies about me, then I would rather face him directly and let him see for himself that his lies have no foundation. Gideon studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with concern in his pale eyes. You are braver than I expected, Alina. Braver than I might be myself in your position. I am not brave, Alina said quietly. I am simply tired of being someone else's problem to manage quietly. If Lord Hale wants a confrontation, I would rather meet it honestly than spend the rest of my time here hiding in fear of a man I have never even met. Lord Hale arrived on a bitterly cold afternoon, his carriage far grander than the one that had carried Alina North weeks earlier, drawn by 4 matched horses, and accompanied by an entourage of servants that seemed excessive for a simple neighborly visit. He was an imposing man, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with sharp eyes that missed very little as he stepped down into the courtyard, his daughter following close behind him. The daughter, whom Lord Hale introduced as Isabel, was younger than Alina expected, perhaps only 17, with a nervous, uncertain manner that suggested she had little enthusiasm for whatever plan her father intended to pursue. Alina found herself feeling an unexpected sympathy for the girl, recognizing in her something of her own recent experience. A young woman being moved across the board of her family's ambitions with little say in the matter herself. Your Grace, Lord Hale said, his voice booming across the courtyard as he clasped Gideon's hand with excessive warmth. It has been far too long since we last spoke properly. I trust you received my letter. I did, Gideon said evenly, his expression carefully neutral. Welcome to Frostmere, Lord Hale. Allow me to introduce Lady Alina Wren, who has been my guest these past several weeks. Lord Hale's sharp eyes turned toward Alina, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, though she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily rather than look away. Lady Wren, he said slowly, as though testing the name against some memory. I do not believe I know your family well. From the south, I take it. Yes, my lord, Alina said, keeping her voice pleasant despite the wariness coiling in her chest. I am visiting Frostmere at the Duke's invitation, extended in honor of an old family connection between our households. An old family connection, Lord Hale repeated, something skeptical flickering across his features. How interesting that I have never heard of it before now. Not every connection between families finds its way into court gossip, Lord Hale, Gideon said smoothly, stepping slightly forward, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection that Alina did not miss. Shall we move inside out of this cold? I imagine you and Isabel would welcome some warmth after your journey. The dinner that evening was tense in a way Alina had never experienced, every polite exchange carrying an undercurrent of careful maneuvering. Lord Hale pressed Gideon repeatedly about his intentions toward Isabel, praising his daughter's virtues at length while pointedly ignoring Alina's presence at the table whenever possible, as though by refusing to acknowledge her fully he might diminish whatever claim she held on the household. It was over dessert that the confrontation Alina had been dreading finally arrived. Lord Hale set down his glass with deliberate care and turned his sharp gaze directly toward her. Tell me, Lady Wren, what exactly brought you north to Frostmere, so far from your family's home? It seems an unusual arrangement for an unmarried young woman to travel alone, staying in the household of an unmarried duke, with no chaperone that I have observed. The table fell silent. Alina felt every eye turned toward her, and beneath the table she felt Gideon's hand find hers briefly, a small gesture of reassurance before he withdrew it and prepared to answer on her behalf. But Alina spoke first, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. My family and the Duke's family share a history that predates either of our births, Lord Hale, she said, meeting his gaze directly rather than looking away. A promise made between our great-grandparents' generation, honored faithfully across the years that followed. I came to Frostmere because that promise called for it, and I have remained here because I have found, in these past weeks, a household of genuine kindness and honesty, qualities I have not always found readily available elsewhere. The pointed edge in her final words was not lost on Lord Hale, whose expression tightened slightly before he recovered his composure. A curious kind of promise, Lady Wren, that involves an unmarried woman residing so intimately within a bachelor's household. Curious, perhaps, Gideon said, his voice carrying a warning edge that Alina had not heard from him before, but entirely honorable, Lord Hale, and not a matter I intend to justify further at my own dinner table. I would ask that you extend Lady Wren the same courtesy you would extend any guest under my roof. Lord Hale held Gideon's gaze for a long moment, some silent calculation passing behind his sharp eyes before he finally inclined his head, a gesture more grudging than gracious. Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense. I only wished to understand the situation more fully, given my own hopes regarding Isabel's future happiness. The rest of the dinner passed with careful, strained politeness, but Alina did not miss the way Lord Hale's gaze lingered on her throughout the remainder of the evening, calculating, dissatisfied, clearly unwilling to abandon whatever plan he had arrived with simply because his first attempt at confrontation had been deflected. She understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that this was not the end of the matter. Lord Hale had not traveled all this way to be turned aside so easily, and whatever he intended to do next, she suspected it would not be nearly so direct or so easily countered as his questions over dinner had been. Later that night, after Lord Hale and Isabel had retired to their rooms, Alina found Gideon standing alone in the great hall, staring into the dying embers of the fire with an expression heavier than she had seen since her first evening at Frostmere. "He will not simply leave quietly, will he?" she asked, crossing the hall to stand beside him. "No," Gideon admitted. "Lord Hale is not a man accustomed to disappointment, Alina, and he has invested a great deal of pride in the idea of uniting our families. I fear tonight's confrontation was only the opening move in whatever plan he intends to pursue." Alina wrapped her arms around herself against a chill that had little to do with the temperature of the hall. "Then we had best prepare ourselves for whatever comes next." Gideon turned to look at her, something fierce and protective settling into his pale eyes. "Whatever comes next, Alina, I promise you this. I will not allow Lord Hale, or anyone else, to undo what we have carefully built here these past weeks. Not without a fight he will regret starting." Outside, the wind picked up once more, rattling against the tall windows of the great hall, and somewhere in the depths of Frostmere, in a guest room prepared with far less care than Alina's own had been, Lord Hale sat awake long into the night, already composing the next move in a plan that would test everything Alina and Gideon had built between them, far more severely than a single tense dinner ever could. Lord Hale's plan revealed itself 3 days later, not through direct confrontation, but through something far more calculated. Alina woke to the sound of raised voices echoing up from the courtyard below her window, and when she looked out, she saw a second carriage arriving through the gates, this one bearing a crest she did not recognize, though the urgency with which its passenger disembarked suggested trouble had arrived alongside it. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, arriving in the entrance hall just as Gideon emerged from his study, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. Mrs. Price stood nearby, wringing her hands, and beyond them in the doorway stood a man Alina did not recognize, travel-worn and clearly exhausted from a hard ride. "What has happened?" Alina asked, moving to Gideon's side. "This is a messenger from the south," Gideon said grimly. "From your family's estate, Alina. It seems Lord Hale sent word ahead of his own departure, informing your father of certain rumors regarding your residence here at Frostmere. Rumors he claims to have heard second-hand, though we both know precisely where they originated." Alina's stomach dropped. "What rumors?" The messenger, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable delivering his message in person, cleared his throat before speaking. "Forgive me, my lady, but but Lord Hale's letter suggested that you have been residing improperly within the Duke's household, without proper chaperone, and that your reputation, along with your family's, stood in serious jeopardy unless the matter was resolved quickly. Your father has sent me to retrieve you immediately, before further damage can be done to the family name. Alina felt the floor shift beneath her, though she remained standing through sheer force of will. Lord Hale had not simply pressed his case with Gideon directly. He had gone around them both, striking at the one point of vulnerability he knew would force their hand, the fragile reputation of a family already teetering on the edge of ruin. "This is his revenge," she said quietly, turning to Gideon. "For refusing him at dinner. He could not force you into a match with Isabel directly, so he has chosen instead to destroy the arrangement he could not control." "It would seem so," Gideon said, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury. "Cowardly but effective. He knows precisely how fragile your family's standing has become, and he has aimed directly for that weakness rather than confront either of us honestly." The messenger shifted uncomfortably. "My lady, your father was quite insistent. He has instructed me to bring you south immediately, regardless of the circumstances here. He fears further scandal if you remain even a day longer." Alina felt anger rising in her chest, sharp and sudden, directed not only at Lord Hale but at her own father, who had once again chosen the easiest path of protecting the family's reputation, rather than standing firmly behind his own daughter. She had come to Frostmere believing herself already discarded, and now, weeks later, she was being summoned back not out of love or concern for her well-being, but out of the same cold calculation that had sent her north in the first place. "I will not go," she said, and the words surprised her with their steadiness. "Not like this. Not because Lord Hale has decided to punish us both for refusing to bend to his ambitions." "Alina," Gideon said quietly, turning to face her fully, "if you remain here now, after such an accusation has already reached your family, the scandal Lord Hale threatens may grow far worse than either of us can easily undo. I would not ask you to sacrifice your family standing for my sake." "You are not asking," Alina said firmly. "I am choosing." "There is a difference, Gideon, and I would rather you understand it clearly. I did not come north because I wanted to hide from scandal. I came because my family sent me away, and I have found, in the weeks since, something worth staying for that has nothing to do with debts or curses or old promises. If I leave now, running south the moment Lord Hale snaps his fingers, I prove nothing except that his lies have power over me, and I refuse to give him that satisfaction." Gideon studied her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful passing across his features. "Then what would you have us do instead?" Alina turned to the exhausted messenger. "You will return to my father with a message from me directly. Tell him that I remain at Frostmere by my own choice, that no impropriety has occurred within these walls, and that if he wishes to salvage what remains of our family's reputation, he would do better to publicly denounce Lord Hale's baseless accusations rather than punish the daughter who has done nothing to deserve them." The messenger hesitated. "My lady, I do not know if your father will accept such a message without seeing you in person." "Then he will have to trust my word, as he should have trusted it from the beginning," Alina said, her voice carrying a steel she had not known she possessed until that moment. "I am done being managed, moved, and discarded at the family's convenience. If my father wishes to see me safely return to good standing, he can help me confront this scandal directly, rather than sweep it under another hasty exile." Gideon stepped forward, addressing the messenger directly. "You may also inform Lord Wren that I, personally, guarantee Lady Wren's conduct and reputation during her stay at Frostmere, and that I intend to make that guarantee public if Lord Hale continues to spread accusations that have no foundation in truth. A duke's word carries weight even Lord Hale cannot easily dismiss." The messenger nodded slowly, clearly relieved to be given a clear message to carry rather than the impossible task of forcing Alina's return against her will. As he departed, Gideon turned back to Alina, something urgent settling into his expression. "This will not end simply with a message, Alina. Lord Hale has committed himself publicly now. He will not back down easily, not without losing face himself. We must be prepared for whatever he attempts next." They did not have long to wait. That very evening, as a fierce storm began rolling in from the mountains, thunder cracking despite the winter cold and snow driving nearly sideways against the windows, Lord Hale himself appeared once more at Frostmere's gates, having ridden hard from wherever he had traveled after leaving days earlier, his expression furious as he was shown into the great hall where Gideon and Alina waited. "You dare to challenge my word publicly, your grace?" Lord Hale demanded, storming across the hall without waiting for formal greeting. "I have heard that you sent word south, guaranteeing this woman's conduct, contradicting everything I reported to her own father." "I contradicted nothing but a lie, Lord Hale," Gideon said, his voice cold and steady despite the fury radiating from the man before him. "You spread accusations you knew to be false, out of nothing more than wounded pride at my refusal to consider a match with your daughter. I will not allow you to destroy an innocent woman's reputation simply because you cannot accept rejection gracefully." "Innocent?" Lord Hale scoffed, his gaze flicking toward Alina with open contempt. "A young woman residing alone in a bachelor's household for weeks on end. Whatever careful words you choose to describe the arrangement, your grace, the appearance alone is damning enough, and appearances are all that matter in the circles that determine both our families' standing." "Then let us discuss appearances honestly," Alina said, stepping forward before Gideon could respond, her voice carrying clearly across the hall despite the storm raging beyond the windows. "You arrived at Frostmere with your own daughter in tow, Lord Hale, hoping to press a match you knew the Duke had already refused on multiple occasions. When that failed, rather than accept his decision with any grace, you chose instead to attack the reputation of a woman who has done nothing except exist within his household, under an arrangement neither improper nor secret. Tell me, my lord, which of us has behaved with less honor tonight?" Lord Hale's face reddened with fury, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly, particularly by a young woman he had expected to intimidate into silence. "You forget your place, Lady Wren. I could ruin your family entirely with a single letter to the right people at court." "You could try," Gideon said, stepping forward to stand directly beside Alina, his presence a clear and deliberate show of unified defense. "But I would remind you, Lord Hale, that I hold considerably more influence at court than you do, and I would not hesitate to use every ounce of it to defend Lady Wren's reputation, and to expose your own conduct here tonight for exactly what it is. A petty, vindictive attempt to punish two people for refusing to bend to your ambitions." The storm outside chose that moment to intensify, thunder crashing loudly enough to rattle the tall windows of the great hall, and in the sudden flash of lightning that illuminated the room, Alina saw something shift in Lord Hale's expression, the first flicker of genuine uncertainty beneath his bluster. "You would truly risk your own standing at court, your grace, over a woman you have known only a matter of weeks?" he asked, though the confidence had drained noticeably from his voice. "I would risk far more than that," Gideon said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of his answer seemed to strike Lord Hale harder than any louder declaration could have managed. "Because unlike you, Lord Hale, I have learned the difference between ambition and genuine regard, and I know which one I am no longer willing to sacrifice for the sake of easier appearances." The hall fell silent except for the storm continuing to rage beyond the windows. Lord Hale studied them both for a long, tense moment, some final calculation working behind his sharp eyes, before he finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging with something between defeat and grudging acceptance. "Very well," he said stiffly. "I will send word retracting my earlier claims, your grace, if only to avoid the further scandal such a public dispute between our households would surely bring upon us both. But do not expect friendship between our families after tonight." "I expect nothing from you, Lord Hale, except honesty from this point forward," Gideon said. "That will be more than sufficient." Lord Hale departed within the hour, back out into the storm he had arrived through, and as his carriage disappeared through the gates once more, Alina felt the tension that had gripped her chest for days finally begin to loosen, replaced by something closer to exhausted relief. "You did not have to defend me so publicly," she said quietly, once they were alone again in the great hall, the storm still rattling softly against the windows. "You could have let the accusation quietly fade, rather than risk your own standing so openly." "I could have," Gideon agreed, turning to face her fully, something warm and unguarded settling into his expression. "But I did not want to, Alina. I told you once that I would not force you into an affection you did not freely choose. Tonight, I understood something else just as clearly. I no longer wish to hide the affection I have chosen freely for you." Alina's breath caught, and in the flickering candlelight of the great hall, with the storm still raging beyond the tall windows, she found herself, for the first time since arriving at Frostmere, entirely certain of what she wanted. "Then do not hide it any longer," she said softly, "because I have chosen it too, Gideon." Freely and without any doubt remaining. The storm passed some time before dawn, leaving Frostmere blanketed in fresh snow so pure, and untouched it seemed to erase every trace of the tension that had gripped the household over the previous days. Alina woke early, unable to sleep long despite the exhaustion of the night before, and made her way to the window to watch the pale morning light spread slowly across the frozen gardens below. Something had shifted permanently the night before, she realized, standing there in the quiet stillness of early morning. Not simply between herself and Gideon, though that shift alone felt significant enough to steady an entire lifetime upon. Something had shifted within herself as well. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had climbed into a carriage weeks earlier, believing herself discarded, sent north to be forgotten by a family too ashamed to keep her close. She had stood in that great hall and defended herself against a powerful man's accusations, had spoken with a steadiness she had not known she possessed, and had chosen, freely and without hesitation, to remain exactly where she wished to be. A soft knock came at her door, and when she opened it, she found Mrs. Price waiting, an expression of careful warmth on her face that Alina had not seen from the housekeeper before. "The Duke asks if you might join him in the garden this morning, my lady. He says the snow has settled beautifully, and he would like to show you something before breakfast." Alina dressed quickly, choosing a warm cloak from the wardrobe, and made her way down through the quiet corridors of Frostmere, past the portraits whose painted eyes no longer felt quite so unsettling as they once had, out through a side door into the frozen gardens where she had walked with Gideon many times over the past weeks. She found him standing near the center of the garden, beside the frozen fountain that had been silent since her arrival, his dark hair dusted lightly with falling snow, his expression carrying a nervousness she had not seen from him even during his confrontation with Lord Hale the night before. "You wish to show me something?" she asked, approaching slowly. "I did," Gideon said, and something in his voice made her heart quicken. He reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a small object, wrapped carefully in dark cloth, which he unfolded to reveal a ring, simple but elegant, set with a stone the same pale blue-green as the curtains in her room, the color she had loved since she was a girl of 16. Alina's breath caught entirely. "Gideon." "I know this is sudden," he said quickly, though his voice remained steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. "I know we have known each other only a matter of weeks, that this entire arrangement began under circumstances neither of us chose freely at first. But last night, standing beside you against Lord Hale, I understood something I have perhaps known for longer than I have been willing to admit. I do not wish to simply satisfy an old family promise, Alina. I wish to build something entirely my own with you, freely chosen, exactly as Cordelia once hoped someone might, all those years ago." Alina looked at the ring, then at the man holding it before her, this careful, honest Duke who had spent a decade quietly watching over her life before she had ever known his name, who had defended her reputation without hesitation the night before, who had promised, from their very first conversation, never to force affection she did not freely choose. "I did not come to Frostmere expecting to find this," she said softly. "I came believing myself already forgotten, already discarded by everyone who mattered to me. I did not expect to find someone who had been waiting, quietly, for longer than I could have imagined, hoping I might arrive and find something worth staying for. "And did you find it?" Gideon asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made her chest ache with tenderness. "Something worth staying for." "I did," Alina said, and she found she was smiling, truly and fully, for the first time since she had climbed into that carriage weeks earlier. "I found it in this house, in these gardens, in a library full of old journals and older secrets. But mostly, Gideon, I found it in you." Gideon's expression broke into something like disbelief mixed with pure, unguarded joy, and he stepped forward, taking her hand carefully in his own. "Then will you stay, Alina? Not because an old promise demands it, not because your family has nowhere else to send you, but because you choose it freely, exactly as I am choosing you." "Yes," Alina said, her voice steady and certain despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Yes, Gideon, I choose this. I choose you." He slid the ring carefully onto her finger, and as he did, something in the frozen garden around them seemed to shift, subtle but unmistakable, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for generations, waiting for exactly this moment to finally exhale. News of the engagement spread quickly once Gideon sent formal word to Alina's family, and to the wider court beyond Frostmere's frozen borders. Her father, upon learning that his daughter had not only avoided scandal, but had secured a match with one of the wealthiest and most respected titles in the North, responded with an enthusiasm that Alina found she could not entirely trust, though she chose not to dwell on his sudden change of heart. She had learned over the past weeks that her own happiness no longer depended on her family's approval, however welcome that approval might now be. Her sister wrote a long, joyful letter, filled with questions about Frostmere and the mysterious Duke, who had apparently been watching over their family for years without anyone's knowledge, and Alina found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember as she read it, imagining her sister's wide-eyed astonishment upon learning the full, strange story of Cordelia's promise and everything that had followed from it. Lord Hale, true to his word, sent a formal retraction of his earlier accusations, though the letter carried none of the warmth or grace one might have hoped for, only the stiff, grudging correctness of a man who had lost and knew it. Alina did not concern herself with his continued displeasure. She had faced him directly once, and she suspected she would not need to face him again. The wedding was planned for early spring, once the worst of the northern winter had passed, and the roads leading to Frostmere would be safe enough for guests to travel without the danger Alina herself had faced on her own journey north. In the months leading up to it, Alina threw herself into learning the full history of Frostmere, spending long hours in the library with Gideon, piecing together fragments of Cordelia's story alongside the older, more distant history of the broken betrothal that had started the entire chain of misfortune and loneliness generations before either of them was born. They found, eventually, a final entry in an even older ledger, tucked behind a loose stone in the library wall that Gideon had discovered quite by accident while searching for a missing volume. It was a letter, written by the young Ashford heir whose betrothal had been broken so many generations earlier, addressed to no one in particular, as though he had written it simply to release some private grief he could not otherwise express. "I do not blame her for choosing love over obligation," the letter read, its ink faded nearly to illegibility in places. "I only grieve that our families could not find a way to release one another gently from a promise neither of us made freely. If some part of this house remembers my sorrow long after I am gone, I hope it also remembers this. I wish her joy wherever she has gone, and I wish, for whatever descendants follow after me, that they might one day find the same freely chosen joy that I was denied, without the weight of old promises pressing upon their choice." Alina read the letter aloud to Gideon in the quiet of the library, her voice growing thick with emotion by the final lines, and when she finished, Gideon reached for her hand, his own eyes bright with feeling he did not try to hide. "He would be glad, I think," Gideon said softly, "to know that his sorrow eventually led to this. Not simply the paying of an old debt, but genuine happiness, freely found, exactly as he hoped for whoever came after him." I think Cordelia would be glad too, Alina said, thinking of the young woman's journal, the hope buried within her final entry, written as fever took hold of her more than 60 years before. She wrote that she hoped whoever followed her north would find a home here, not a curse. I think we have finally proven her right. The wedding, when it finally arrived in early spring, was a quiet affair by the standards of court society, held in the great hall of Frostmere itself, rather than in some grander cathedral to the south, surrounded by the household staff who had come to know and care for Alina over the months of her residence, and by the small circle of family members who had traveled north to witness the union. Alina's mother wept openly throughout the ceremony, and even her father, standing stiffly beside her, seemed genuinely moved by the sight of his daughter finding happiness in circumstances he had once arranged purely out of desperate necessity. As Alina stood before Gideon in the candle-lit hall speaking vows that felt entirely her own rather than obligations imposed by family or old promises, she thought back to that first terrifying carriage ride north, the fear that had gripped her as the wheels carried her further and further from everything familiar. She had believed then that she was being sent away to be forgotten, discarded by a family too ashamed to keep her close. She understood now, standing in this hall surrounded by warmth and genuine affection, that she had never truly been forgotten at all. She had simply been waited for, carefully and patiently, by a man who had spent a decade of his life quietly hoping she might one day arrive. After the ceremony, as the small gathering of guests moved into the great hall for the wedding feast, Alina slipped away briefly with Gideon to the frozen gardens, now beginning to thaw with the first gentle warmth of spring, small green shoots pushing up through the melting snow around the fountain where he had proposed months earlier. "Do you remember," Alina said, leaning against him as they watched the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of gold, "how frightened I was arriving here that first night? I thought this house would be the coldest place I had ever known." "And now?" Gideon asked, wrapping his arm around her. "Now I think it might be the warmest," Alina said softly, "not because of the fires or the careful rooms prepared with such thoughtful detail. Because of you, Gideon, because you never once made me feel like a debt to be settled or a curse to be broken. You made me feel like someone worth waiting for." Gideon pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the fading light, watching the last of the winter snow melt away into the soft earth below, the long, generational chill that had gripped both their families finally, truly, beginning to thaw. "They sent you north believing you would be forgotten," Gideon said quietly. "I am glad, more than I can properly express, that they were wrong." "They were wrong about everything," Alina agreed, smiling up at him. "I was never forgotten at all. I was simply always meant to be found." And in the quiet warmth of that spring evening, with the frozen gardens of Frostmere slowly awakening around them, Alina understood that whatever misfortune had once haunted her family, whatever loneliness had once settled into Gideon's, both curses had finally been broken, not through obligation or old debts finally paid, but through something far simpler and far stronger than either. A choice freely made by two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly the home they had never known they were searching for. A year passed at Frostmere, and then another, and the estate that had once felt so cold and forbidding to Alina during that first terrifying carriage ride slowly transformed into something she could hardly recognize from her earliest memories of it. The frozen gardens bloomed fully each spring now, tended with a care Gideon insisted upon, determined that the grounds should reflect the warmth that had finally settled into the house itself. Mrs. Price often remarked, with quiet satisfaction, that she had not seen the halls of Frostmere so full of laughter since long before the old Duke's passing, and Alina found herself agreeing wholeheartedly each time the housekeeper said it. Word of the marriage between the Duke of Frostmere and Lady Alina Wren traveled south eventually, carried through the usual channels of court gossip, and with it traveled a curiosity about the strange and sudden change in fortune that seemed to follow the Wren family in the years afterward. Alina's father, whose debts had once threatened to unravel the family standing entirely, found his own circumstances easing considerably once his connection to the Duke of Frostmere became widely known, though Alina suspected the improvement had less to do with any curse being lifted, and more to do with the practical benefits of being connected, even distantly, to one of the wealthiest titles in the north. She did not begrudge him the relief, though she remained careful, in the years that followed, not to allow her father's renewed warmth toward her to erase the memory of how easily he had once cast her aside. Her sister, Charlotte, visited Frostmere often during those early years, delighted by the strange romance of the estate and endlessly curious about Cordelia's journal, which Alina had carefully preserved in a place of honor within the library rather than leaving it tucked away and forgotten among the older, dustier volumes. It was Charlotte, in fact, who first suggested that the full story of Cordelia's promise, and everything that had followed from it, deserved to be written down properly, not simply preserved in fragments and fading ink, but recorded fully for whatever children might one day inherit Frostmere and wish to understand the strange history that had shaped their family's fortune. Alina took up the task herself over the following winter, spending long evenings by the fire in the great hall, piecing together everything she had learned from Cordelia's journal, from the old letter hidden behind the loose stone in the library wall, and from the careful research Gideon had conducted throughout his own life, watching over her family from a distance long before she had ever known his name. The resulting account, which she titled simply A Promise Kept, became something of a treasured piece of the estate's history, read aloud to guests during long winter evenings and eventually passed down, generation after generation, as a reminder of everything the two families had overcome together. Isabel Hale, whose brief and uncomfortable visit to Frostmere had marked one of the more difficult chapters of that first winter, found her own happiness eventually, though not in the manner her father had originally intended. Alina learned, through occasional correspondence exchanged between the two young women in the years that followed, that Isabel had eventually married a gentle scholar from a modest but respected family, a match her father had initially opposed just as fiercely as he had once pursued the idea of uniting his daughter with the Duke of Frostmere. Alina took quiet satisfaction in learning that Isabel, too, had eventually found the courage to choose her own happiness over her father's ambitions, and the two women maintained a careful, distant friendship over the years, born from the shared experience of having once been treated as pawns in other people's grander plans. Lord Hale himself remained a distant and unpleasant memory, rather than any ongoing presence in their lives. Gideon maintained careful but polite relations with the neighboring estate, enough to avoid any lingering hostility between their households, though the warmth that might have naturally grown between neighboring families in more ordinary circumstances never fully developed. Alina found she did not mind the distance. Some wounds healed more easily when given space to fade quietly on their own, rather than forced into an artificial reconciliation neither party truly desired. It was in the third year of their marriage that Alina discovered she was carrying their first child, and the news brought a wave of quiet joy through the entire household that Alina had not expected, given how carefully both she and Gideon had approached the early years of their marriage, still somewhat wary of the old promises and family expectations that had originally brought them together. But as her pregnancy progressed through that year, Alina found herself thinking often of Cordelia, of the hope the young woman had carried even as fever took her life, hoping that whoever followed her north might find a genuine home rather than another burden to carry. Their daughter was born in the depths of winter, during a storm nearly as fierce as the one that had raged the night Alina finally stood against Lord Hale in the great hall, and Gideon insisted, without any hesitation, that she be named Cordelia, in honor of the woman whose quiet hope had ultimately reshaped both their family's fortunes so completely. Alina agreed immediately, feeling a rightness in the choice that went beyond simple sentiment, a fitting close to the long, strange chain of events that had begun with one woman's broken heart generations earlier and ended, finally, in genuine happiness freely chosen by everyone who followed. As young Cordelia grew, Alina made certain the girl understood the full history of the family she had been born into, not simply the romantic version told during holiday gatherings, but the harder truths as well. The fear Alina herself had carried during that first carriage ride north. The loneliness that had settled so deeply into Gideon's family line across so many generations. The courage it had taken for both of them to choose honesty over easy assumptions, and genuine affection over obligation, even when an old promise might have made obligation the simpler, safer path to follow. "You were not sent here to be forgotten," Alina told her daughter often, during quiet evenings by the same fire where she had once first read Cordelia's journal, the very book now resting on a shelf easily within the young girl's reach. "You were born into a family that chose each other freely, against every expectation placed upon them. Whatever you choose in your own life, Cordelia, choose it as freely as your father and I chose one another. That is the only inheritance truly worth passing down." Frostmere itself changed considerably over the years that followed. Though its ancient stones and towering, ice-touched architecture remained largely unchanged from the imposing structure Alina had first glimpsed through her carriage window all those years earlier. The household grew warmer, both in temperature and in spirit, filled increasingly with the laughter of children, the steady comfort of servants who had come to regard both Alina and Gideon with genuine affection rather than simple professional duty, and the quiet, accumulated warmth of a family finally free from the shadow of old curses and older misfortunes. Gideon, for his part, never stopped marveling at the transformation, often telling Alina, during quiet moments shared in the very garden where he had once proposed, that he had spent so many years of his life believing himself destined for the same solitary, loveless existence his father and grandfather had endured before him, that the genuine happiness he found with her still occasionally struck him as something almost too fragile to fully trust, even years into their marriage. "I do trust it, though," he told her one evening, as they watched their daughter chase fireflies across the garden during one of the estate's brief, precious summer evenings. "Every single day, I trust it a little more." "As do I," Alina said, leaning against him as she had done so many times over the years since that first uncertain conversation in the library. "We were never cursed, Gideon, not truly. We were simply waiting, both of us, for someone brave enough to choose differently than everyone who came before us." Years later, long after Cordelia had grown into a thoughtful young woman herself, and long after Alina's own hair had begun to show the first threads of silver at her temples, visitors to Frostmere would sometimes ask about the strange, romantic history of the estate, having heard fragments of the story through the years of court gossip that inevitably followed such an unusual tale. Alina never tired of telling it properly, correcting the exaggerations and embellishments that had crept into the popular version over time, always careful to emphasize the parts that mattered most. Not the curse, not the debt, not even the old broken betrothal that had set the entire chain of events into motion generations before her own birth. She emphasized, instead, the choice. The moment she had stood in that carriage courtyard, frightened and uncertain, and decided to face whatever waited for her honestly rather than retreat into fear. The moment Gideon had chosen honesty over the comfortable distance he might have maintained instead. The moment they had both chosen each other freely, against every expectation and old obligation pressing down upon them. "They sent me north believing I would be forgotten," she would tell curious guests, settled comfortably in the great hall that had once felt so cold and unfamiliar to her, now warmed by generations of genuine affection built patiently across the years. "But I was never forgotten at all. I was simply waited for patiently and honestly until I was finally ready to be found. And that, I have come to believe, is a far better story than any curse could ever tell." Outside, beyond the tall windows of the great hall, the gardens of Frostmere bloomed fully in the golden light of another warm summer evening, the frozen fountain long since restored to its gentle, flowing music, the ice that had once gripped the estate so completely finally, fully thawed.